Thank you, Fiona, for that really nice introduction, and thank you to Melissa for putting me in connection with everybody so that I have the opportunity to come here. And thank you guys for taking time out of this afternoon to come out and listen to me talk. I'm looking forward to discussing this project with you today. The talk I have prepared for today is called The Logic of Gender Justice, and it's based on a project that I've been working on with Multidimensionality for, well, I always hate it when it seems like about 10 years, and so it seems like a long time, but it is a long time. But anyway, so this is the project is one that is basically fundamentally, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what I'm going to do, is really fundamentally about the multidimensionality of thinking about gender justice. So if I was the kind of person that pluralized things, I would call it something like the logics of gender justice, but I'm not that kind of person. And gender justice is really multidimensional, is the kind of thing we're saying. And so in a lot of ways, what we're trying to get at is the idea that there's not one model of a woman-friendly welfare state. There's not one model of a woman-friendly policy process. There are multiple models. And I also, I hope you'll see by the end, am not one to leave you with a kind of loosey-goosey, oh, everything's different in different areas type of thing, because I care a lot about being able to have research that informs actual decisions and actual practical politics. And so what I hope you'll see is that what our research has implications for understanding not just why things vary across issues, but how they vary and what you can expect in terms of how the politics of different issues vary in ways that will hopefully inform us about what would be good strategies to take, what kinds of opposition can you expect for different issues and so on. So hopefully you'll see that as if I can not get too bogged down with preliminaries. So one of the things we find in some areas, you see very strong partnerships between feminist movements and international norms, things like CEDAW or those other kinds of big international conventions. But in other areas of women's rights, we see that institutions that sediment class struggles, historical religious contests, become very salient in determining women's rights in particular areas. And so you'll see that this is in different countries and different issues. Our framework hopefully will help you see when these different types of institutions and actors matter. I said gender justice in my title, and specifically today I'm going to be talking about the specific concept of sex equality and talking about equality between women and men, and I can say more about why that is. But I want to just signal that gender justice is a broader concept, and today I'm talking about one little slice of it, which is the concept of equality. The study that I'm talking about is a global study, and by that I mean that we have countries that are drawn from every region of the world and cover about 85% of the world's population. So even though we're presenting statistical analysis that has kind of implicitly is about generalizing to a broader population, really we're quite happy to understand just the countries that we're studying over these years that we're looking at, from 1975 to 2005. We look at 8 different issue areas, although I'm not going to talk about them all today, areas of women's rights, and you see each one is actually many issues, as is always the case. And I'll just say a little bit about how we got into this massive project before I start talking about, like, why did we take on this crazy, multi-year, multi-country, like, why would anybody do this, right? So this actually came out of a discussion that my co-author and I, Mala, and I had. We were sort of talking about different things. And we had some puzzles that we were trying to sort out with, we studied different regions of the world and different issues, and so we thought we knew what was going on with, gender politics and the studies and the issues in the regions that we discussed. But then it seemed like there were really big differences in terms of what we thought we knew. And so figuring out these puzzles is part of what drove us to do this project. So let me just give you an example of some of the puzzles. Governments that are progressive in one area are not always progressive in other areas, right? So you probably can figure this out. But one of the places that this is really driven home for me, as a person who, as a Canadian, as a person who studies Canada, and then also went to Norway and studied Scandinavia quite a bit, is the difference between Nordic and Anglo-American countries on different issues that they're more innovative on. So, Canada and the United States and Australia really tend to be leaders in terms of innovating new policies in the area of violence against women. So even though in Canada we're always critical, appropriately, of and maybe even are losing some of that edge in the past 10 years or so, but appropriately critical about limits to our policies in terms of how well they address violence against women. In global context, a lot of the things that we do get adopted around the world as kind of best practices. So I even know that, like in Indiana, down the street, the shelter down the street from me uses a risk assessment profile that was developed in Ontario. Israel, people use the same kind of risk assessment, like training protocols and different things. from Canada. There's lots of different kinds of innovative spread around the world of policies that are developed in Canada, the United States, and Australia in particular. The same is not true, of course, for things like childcare, maternity leave, right? Especially in the United States. This is a place where you're keenly aware of the limits of our policies. We have no paid maternity leave in the United States, one of the only countries in the world which does not provide publicly mandated maternity leave. So then you, on the other hand, you're looking at a place like Sweden or Norway. Like Norway, the first country in the world to introduce what's called a daddy leave, which is a non-transferable parental leave, which goes to fathers. Very generous parental and maternity leaves across the Scandinavian countries. Very innovative policies, trying to find ways to share the burden of care work for children more equally between the sexes. And so, not progressive, though, as people sometimes don't remember when you come to talking about violence against women, quite late to the game to address many of the things there. I'll say more about that in a minute. Rich countries are not always the most progressive than poor countries. In the 1990s, Brazil and Argentina were adopting innovative policies relatively on violence against women. Finland, Italy, and Spain were not. And as you'll see when I show you later, remind me if I don't show this to you, you'll see that Latin America looks to be more progressive than Europe in around the mid-90s when you're talking about violence against women. So that's an important thing to be thinking about when we're thinking about what explains cross-national variation. And last, kind of the things you might think are kind of our go-to usual explanations in comparative politics, things like religion, region, family of nations, if you like that concept, don't really give us much leverage on many of these policy variations. Turkey and Morocco, for example, if we want to think about predominantly Muslim countries, both overhaul family law, whereas Saudi Arabia does not. Or, in the case of Iran and Indonesia, actually increase the degree of sex inequality in family law. Why is that? Italy and Ireland, both predominantly Catholic countries, one has fully funded legal access to abortion, one is the only country in the developed world to strengthen opposition to abortion and entrench it in the Constitution. If you look at violence against women, however, reverse, right? Italy slow to get off the dime to start addressing violence against women. Women's movements demanding action, nothing happening for 20 years. Ireland is addressing many more areas of violence. So why these differences? What explains these patterns? And one way you might think about this is, what's the thing that's going to give us the woman-friendly welfare state? And that's when I have my feminist clown that Melissa was joking. It's a trick question, right? There's no one thing. There isn't a simple answer. There are no easy answers. There are cross-issue differences, as I mentioned, within a single country over time. And one of the reasons it's really important to think about these cross-issue differences, and why I'm harping on that a little bit, is that what that means is that there's not one feature of the polity that explains women-friendliness. There can't be. So a lot of our favorite explanations can't possibly work, right? Because they don't work in the same country on two different issues, right? So it can't be modernization, it can't be democracy, it can't be percentage of women in government, it can't be one model for gender equality policy because of this cross-issue variation. So what can it be if we don't have any of these easy answers, right? We need to explain why is it different. So the thing that we are trying to say here is that you can start to get an answer to this question by thinking about different dimensions of gender. Thinking about the different underlying dimensions of gender. Gender is not one dimension, it's multidimensional. So the dimensions that we want people to think about in terms of trying to understand some of these variations are starting with class and nation and religion. Those are sort of underlying dimensions. And they may not be related to each other in any kind of simple fashion. And I just wanted to say a couple things about multidimensionality. So, you can say, oh, multidimensionality, that sounds really great. What does it really mean? Well, it could mean a lot of different things, right? So I'm not really telling you specifically what it means, except to say that once we start to really recognize that there are distinct dimensions to gender, then some of the questions are, well, what are they, and how are they related to each other? And there could be lots of different ways they could be related. So they could be, related so that as you improve along one, you go along the other, or they might not be, right? I mean, these are something that we would have to think about and try to figure out. So it really is the case that once we recognize if there are really different dimensions to gender, then we have a job. We all have a theoretical job to do to figure out what the relationship is. And so this is just another 2-dimension, 3-dimension. It gets complicated, right? So even though it's complicated, we think we have a framework to help guide you through all this complexity, at least a starting place. And what we're saying here is these dimensions, we're defining different dimensions as they relate to key identities and institutions. So the way you think about equality initiatives, you have to ask the question, what are the key identities that are triggered by this equality initiative? What are the key institutions that are challenged? And so you'll see what I mean by that. And of course, movements are contesting these kinds of relationships, so that's why they're important. So this goes to saying that this is how we distinguish dimensions, and this is why they vary the way they do. We're not just observing this cross-issue variation. Understanding these dimensions tells us why this variation happens the way it does. So here's the 2x2 table, and this is where my training as a political scientist comes in. I apologize to people who are in the gender studies thing. It's something you just can't escape after so many years of political science. So this is kind of a starting cut at a framework for understanding the variation across issues. The first question we ask is the equality issue a doctrinal issue? And what do we mean by that? Does it challenge the established doctrine of the dominant religion? Is the way we're defining that question. Yes, if it does, then you have to expect to ask a bunch of questions about religious politics that are otherwise not relevant. Or no, then you don't have to ask those questions. Another thing that we have to ask about are the way that the policy relates to class. So these class issues partly are about politics among women, right? So it's about creating equality among women, among families, rather than specifically looking at relations between women and men necessarily. So some of these policies that are class policies are about how the state relates to the market, rather than, say, how the state relates to the church, right? You can think about those as two different institutional kind of constellations that form the background for gender policies. Sometimes you're challenging the way the states relate to the market, sometimes you're not. Sometimes you're challenging the way the state relates to the church or mosque or whatever, and sometimes you're not. So if it's challenging state-market relations, as it is often in the case of maternity leave, parental leave, childcare, then a whole bunch of usual suspects of left politics become relevant, right? Talk about left parties and unions and all of these kinds of people. But those are not so relevant, for example, if you're talking about something that's more of a religious issue, more of a doctrinal issue. There's one cell that involves both of these dimensions, and then you have the whole array of gender politics, actors and institutions involved. So in that 2x2 table, then, there's 4 types of issues. So just as a start, we'll say, here's what you would expect for each of those 4 types. So if you take this top left cell, these are the ones we're calling status issues. And this is where I was saying before, social movements and international norms have a lot of impact, partly because there's less opposition domestically, and partly because social movements are necessary for articulating some of these issues. These are the main drivers for this area. If you're looking at the top right-hand column, or that bottom row, that's when it starts to be more complicated. This is where I was talking about where it affects church-state relations. So if it's in the top right-hand corner, you expect it to be, if it's in that right column where it's a doctrinal issue, then we expect these religious actors and institutions to be important. If it's in the bottom row, then we expect these left politics, actors and institutions to be relevant. So I'm just going to show you this way. So for each of these 4 types of issues, then, we call these status issues, doctrinal issues, and the class issues on the bottom. And this is the ones that are class and doctrinal issues. Different actors are expected to be relevant. Different institutions are expected to be relevant. So as I mentioned before, feminist movements and international norms for the top left-hand top of issue, religious institutions, and colonialism and communism, and I can say more about that, but I'll give you a really quick sense of that right now. Colonialism, of course, because in post-colonial states, the need for additional sources of legitimacy often causes the states to lean on religious institutions and authorities to bring more legitimacy to the state. It gives the colonial states a place where these religious issues become more difficult to decide. Also, communism has the reverse effect, right? So in post-colonial states, you're more likely to have religiously salient issues become controversial. In post-communist states, the reverse is true, because a legacy of communism is that many of these legal issues, the communists smashed religious institutions and pushed them out of public life, and as part of that process, eliminated many of the vestiges of religion in many areas of law, including many areas of law that are relevant to thinking about women's status. So you have the reverse effect there. When we're talking about the class politics, this is where we're going to be paying attention to left parties, labor movements, as well as feminist movements. So Okay, the sources for the study that I'll just show you in a minute are both qualitative and quantitative. We used primary sources, things like the text of the laws, newspaper reports, as well as secondary sources like published articles for each of these areas. And I worked with my co-author, Malo Tun, for more than 10 years, as I mentioned, to gather and analyze these data. And we also involved a huge team, a research team, and it was funded by the National Science Foundation Political Science Program. And they should not be responsible for the things that we found, but they did fund it. We did field work in Argentina, Israel, Canada, the United States, Malaysia, Nigeria, China, India, and South Korea. So let me just tell you a few illustrative things that have come out of our research and our discussions over the years to kind of show you what I think, where I hope this framework gives us a bit of a payoff. So as I mentioned at the outset, if you look at violence against women in Canada and Sweden, particularly in the 80s and the 90s, you can see a really different pattern that kind of shows the role of autonomous feminist organizing, the importance of that in violence against women. Equality at work versus actual family leave similarly shows the reverse pattern. Morocco's 2004 reform of the family code I want to talk about briefly, and then if I have time I'll talk about the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act and family law in India very quickly. These are just vignettes. I'm not going to give you detailed histories. You'll be relieved to hear. If we look at Canada and Sweden in the 80s and 90s, we can see that, as I mentioned before, Canada is one of the countries that has been a kind of innovator or leader in the issue of violence against women. And so as early as 1967, feminists in Canada were criticizing the Royal Commission on the Status of Women for not including the issue of violence against women. And I want to say this over and over again because when you read histories of feminism around the world, and Melissa's looking appreciative about this, you hear things like, well, feminism started in the United States and spread to the rest of the world, and it started in like 1975 or something like this. But of course, there were lots of feminists all around the world, right? Not just in the United States, going back years and years and years. And on this particular issue, Canadian feminists were articulating this issue in the late 60s. And the Secretary of State Women's Program was really important in providing research that supported these groups. And interviewing one really prominent Canadian feminist, she said the government built the women's movement. And this is something that Georgia George Lady has also said about the United States a little bit. But she really emphasized the role of these different government programs in supporting feminist organizing. And anyway, in this particular case, the program funded important research that supported women's work on this, what was then a kind of taboo and controversial issue. And women were active and protesting for a couple of decades almost before a series of amendments were quickly adopted in 1983. So if you study the legislative process, you might just say, oh, look at this. A bunch of amendments were passed really quickly. It wasn't controversial, but there's a huge period of activism and work and public education that went on before these amendments were passed. This included the Rape Shield Law. The Rape Shield Law that was passed was based on a National Association of Women in the Law proposal, which was endorsed by the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, and it formed the basis for these amendments. As you may or may not know, the Rape Shield Law was struck down in the interim, and then when Kim Campbell was Minister of Justice, I should say one thing. The Minister of Justice who oversaw this original period of the Rape Shield Law was somebody you might have heard of, Jean Chrétien, and a man from the Liberal Party. And the point I want to make is that later this happened. This was very quickly, once the law was struck down, it was very quickly revised. Massive consultations again taking place with feminist movements to make sure that the law addressed the concerns that were being raised by feminists, overseen by the then Minister of Justice, Kim Campbell, a conservative, progressive conservative. So, if we're looking for what was the party that was in power, doesn't matter. What was the gender of the minister, not really determinative. And women were less than 10% of parliament during this whole period, and the government went back and forth with different parties. Looking at Sweden over the same period, women's movements were making efforts, feminist activists were making efforts to raise this issue in Sweden, but they were dismissed and basically seen as being shrill and divisive. Why are you always talking about women? We should talk in universal terms, and we don't have these problems anyway. Legal reforms, such as protective orders, which were pretty standard by, say, 1988 in the U.S. and in Canada, were first adopted in Sweden in 1988. So that's pretty late. And really, there was no public system that provided support to specialized rape crisis centers in Sweden. There were very few. And even as late as 2011, Sweden had a category of minor rape for drunk or for assaulting drunk or unconscious women, and there was no required minimum penalty for this And actually, if you see an Amnesty International report in 2010 of the entire Nordic region, it's quite scathing on sexual assault laws across the entire region. You might remember the minor rape thing from the Julian Assange case, when this whole thing came up, that actually he might have only been guilty of minor rape. And people said, wait, what? What kind of rape? So this is reminiscent of many other kinds of discussions we've had recently about what should be legal and illegal, but there really is lots to reform still, even in rape law in the Nordic countries. So I just point that out to you as a bit more deep, putting a bit more bones on some of the puzzles I mentioned too early, and say that the reason for that, as the story that I'm telling you about, I hope it illustrates a little bit. The thing I'm pointing to there as accounting for the difference is the autonomous actions of feminists in Canada. Feminists in Canada are mostly autonomous of political parties. Outside of political parties, sure, getting support from the state, but mostly independent. They have independent umbrella organizations, and they're able to raise these issues and keep people's feet to the fire, make fun, literally, of members of parliament, and to really push the issue onto the public agenda. In Sweden, a lot of the most influential feminists are inside political parties. They're not autonomous of the state. No matter what you think of the Swedish women's movement, it's historically, nobody's ever thought it was autonomous. So it is entirely enclosed in the state. And that really matters for an issue like violence against women, which is not going to be fitting nicely into the Labour Party's platform, an unreconstructed Labour Party platform. Maybe now, at least this year it would be, but not in 1980 or 1990. Okay, so really the autonomous nature of feminism is the key thing. And I'm also trying to make the point that the left parties and the large numbers of women in government in Norway and Sweden didn't seem to make the difference here. If we look at the other way, this is going the wrong way. Hold on. If we look at the different comparison, work family policies, you see a different kind of comparison and a different kind of story. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act in the United States, 1978, is often cited as one of the most textbook cases of feminist success. I can see people going, yes. So this is often seen as this is the model for feminist success. A coalition of women's groups independently. One thing that people don't notice sometimes is that actually they were also supported by some kinds of religious groups, and that was contingent on them leaving abortion out of the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. It had to be specifically excluded from the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. But however, basically this is primarily driven by a group of autonomous women's organizations who very quickly prosper this act. It's successful. It gets passed in 1978. The Family Medical Leave Act is far more contested. It's passed twice by Democratic Congress, vetoed each time by President Bush the father, not George Bush, not George W. Bush, George Herbert Bush. So the father who vetoes it twice, it finally becomes law when it's passed yet again and is signed by President Clinton. So political parties are making a big difference here. Elections have consequences when it comes to the Family Medical Leave Act. I don't want to make it sound like it's a big deal, though, because of course it's unpaid leave. But this is what we have to do to get unpaid leave in the United States. Feminist movements are putting this legal equality on the agenda in the case of the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, but weak unions, no left party, and business opposition hamper a really full-blown proposal for paid leave in the U.S. In Norway, you have basically same year, same stuff going on with this Equal Status Act, right? Women's groups are getting together. Unions oppose it, of course, right? No, I'm saying no, of course, maybe it's surprising, but the unions actually opposed the Equal Status Act originally. Eventually, they started to kind of leave it alone. But it ended up being supported by ultimately labor and conservative governments, but had some opposition from organized labor, but ultimately was adopted. Maternity leave expansions are very clearly a proposal and initiative of the labor government, supported strongly by the labor government in power in the 1980s, and in particular the daddy leave, Fedderquota, were initiatives undertaken under a very progressive feminist man who headed the Labor Party, who was championed a huge nationwide discussion of fatherhood and what it meant to be a good father, and championed this whole daddy leave thing, which went beyond kind of just adding weeks to maternity leave, which was some of the maternity leave expansions were, because the initial maternity leave adoption, of course, preceded any of the stuff we've been talking about. It's 100 years old or something. But the daddy leaves were 1995, and they were these new policies, an innovative policy, which required a new kind of way of thinking about the state's role. So, in this case, you see the movements are driving the employment status law, with the unions being opposed to it at one point, whereas left parties are driving the expansions of maternity leave. So again, in one country, you can see the difference across these issues is falling into the framework that I was talking to you about. Now, to pick up a little bit on some of the doctrinal element, let me talk a little bit about Moroccan family reform. So again, this is a case where feminist movements put the issue on the agenda. In Morocco, you may have heard of the 1 million signatures campaign. It's one of the most famous feminist campaigns in comparative politics, and it's emulated in other countries. It puts that family law on the agenda. And in 1993, in some ways, there are some modest reforms. Morocco ratified CEDAW in the same year. And over this period, there's a process of democratization, moving from moving towards more involvement, more democracy in Morocco. In 1997, but after this kind of modest reforms taken place, the feminist criticisms continue, right? So they're saying, well, yeah, that's very nice. These are modest reforms. They're not quite what we wanted. We wanted more than this. We don't want to still have husbands having all this say over their wives. There's still lots of things that we need to do. They continue to criticize the government, who was not really interested in doing much more. And then they embarrassed the government in the 1990s at the CEDAW hearings, the CEDAW discussions of Morocco's family law. After this embarrassment, the government came back home and said, okay, so let's do something about this, and proposed, basically, and at this point the socialists are in power, and they turned to the women's movements, and Val Mogadam reports that they basically said to them, well, are you socialists? I hope so, so let's just do what you want to do here. And basically adopted the proposal that the women's movements had suggested to try to put forward. It was extremely controversial and prompted tremendous protest from religious authorities in Morocco, who painted it as being an initiative of the World Bank, which wasn't true, and said, here come the international financiers to bring their uncivilized ways to our family law and to corrupt our family law and our values, and there were massive protests. And ultimately, these proposals were shelved and were unsuccessful. They could not be passed. So we had feminist movements getting on the agenda, we had sympathetic allies, and yet religious protests prevented the proposals from going forward. In 2003, a new king was elected, more liberal, more interested, and feminists once again brought up the issue. And this king said to them, took another look at the issue and thought, okay, let's work together with feminists and also with religious authorities. Feminists themselves were working to really embed their proposals more in religious law and ended up working with religious authorities, and this time they were successful. One key thing, it's hard to know how important this was and successful, was that there was a terrorist explosion that really undercut the kind of moral authority of the religious authorities around the time that these proposals were being considered. It may have weakened them. But in the end, the proposals were passed with the support of the Islamists, and Morocco is now seen as having one of the most egalitarian versions of family law across the Muslim world, and maybe the best version of feminist family law. So in all the areas that we look at, basically by the end of the period, they've reformed the inequality in family law by the end of the period. So it's a massive reform. So if you look at India, if you compare what's going on in India over the same period, you see that, just think about divorce law in India for a minute as a kind of comparative issue which gets pushed up to the front. In this case, it comes to the fore because the Supreme Court, if you're familiar with, India has divided its personal law so that there's different personal law for each different religion. So Muslims are governed by Muslim personal law, Hindus are governed by Hindu personal law, and so on. Christians are governed by Christian personal law. So in the case of Muslims who are a minority in India, the Supreme Court took upon itself to make a decision saying that a particular practice was a violation of law in India. This was seen as being interference in the proper area of authority of the Muslim Personal Law Board, which is the board that's empowered to make decisions about Muslim personal law in India. And Muslim organizers organized tremendous opposition to this decision. Feminists at that time were demanding a uniform civil code. They were demanding a secular personal law. Move away from these religious laws, create a secular personal law that gives everybody the rights that they want. These days, out of that whole controversy came the Muslim Women's Protection of Rights in Divorce Act, so-called because you might think it would improve women's rights, but as these things go, it actually undermined the rights that were given to women in the Supreme Court case that caused the controversy in the first place and strengthened the Muslim Personal Law Board. However, now, personal law in India, feminists have abandoned the effort of trying to get a uniform civil code because nationalist parties like the BJP have taken up the call for reform of Muslim personal law as a kind of project to foment inter-community hatred and rivalry and to emphasize the backwardness of Muslims in India, and feminists don't want to be any part of that. So in the end, they've ended up saying, okay, fine, we abandon the call for uniform civil code and will only work within religions, kind of like the way feminists in Morocco did, to try to achieve some small reforms. And they have managed to reform personal law a little bit, working within those religious institutions. If you look at the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act in India, I'll just say a couple things. This is a really important act in terms of providing benefits to rural working women. It it guarantees rural people certain days of work, and there are set-aside positions for women. There are also provisions for creches in these rural areas. And really this was partly women's movements put this issue on the agenda, again in coalition with anti-poverty groups and left politics groups. And again, this was a case where an election had a consequence. The coalition of left-center parties promised to pass this law if they were elected. If they were elected, they passed the law, right? So very similar to the thing we were talking about, the Family Medical Leave Act. You have a left party saying they're going to help working women, they do it. Although, one thing to keep in mind is, as they're drafting the law, they're coming under pressure to kind of forget all this stuff about women's guarantees. That's maybe not exactly what we want to do. And the women's activists, feminist activists, pushed hard to keep the guarantees for women in that act. They were very important in that act. So again, the thing I want you to notice about this is religion wasn't a part of the story, right? So this whole part about National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, this is not an issue of religious opposition or support. This was an issue of these left parties winning the election. Okay, so let me show you. Those are sort of some examples of some of the things we were thinking about. Let me show you some of the patterns that we discerned in our study of the 70 countries. So the first thing I'll show you is family law. In our family law index, which looks at inequality in family law, it ranges from 1 to 13, and these things that I'm going to show you. Higher scores reflect more equality, lower scores reflect less equality. And the there are 13 areas of family law that we cover here, including minimum marriage age, consent, inheritance, rights to property, adultery, a bunch of different areas. So I won't say too much about that, except to show you 1975. The main thing I want you to notice about this particular map is that the red areas are the worst areas, and the blue areas are the areas with most equality. So a couple things to notice. One is that there's lots of variation in this map, right? Lots of different colors. So just remember that when we look at 1975 and another map. Another thing to notice is the post-communist countries, up there on the right-hand side, are all starting the period way ahead on equality and family law. And you might remember what I said about how communism smashed religion and introduced equality across a whole bunch of different areas. So if you see 1985, we start to see more equality emerging in other areas, some of those green and blue periods dividing other areas. By 1995, again, we're seeing more convergence. Most of the world is converging on this sort of dark blue or greeny blue type of score, which are the higher scores of equality. We're seeing residue still in MENA, in the Middle East, North Africa region, and some in East Asia, but mostly in the Middle East, North Africa region. And by 2005, really this pattern has become quite clear. Convergence towards equality in most of the world, with a kind of reticence in the Middle East and North Africa. Let me show you a different story that you see if you look at policies on violence against women. This includes our measure of violence against women, looks at services to victims, legal reform, policies aimed at vulnerable populations of women, preventive policies, training professionals, and administrative reforms. And altogether, it ends up being the same sort of thing where you have lower scores meaning less action, higher scores meaning more action on violence. If you look at 1975, this is very different than the story we showed you for family law, right? Much less variation. Most countries in the world are not doing very much to address violence against women in 1975. By 1985 now, we see just a little bit of movement, right? Some governments are taking action on violence. Australia, you may recognize, also Canada and the United States, Sweden, Britain, and France, all taking a little bit of action. By 1995, we're starting to see quite a bit of difference. Now we're seeing the kind of variation that we see at the reverse, right? It starts out being more same and becomes more varied over time. And one thing to notice, this is the thing I was going to tell you about, where if you look at Europe and you compare to Latin America is actually more progressive on this issue. And when I was doing research on this, I interviewed this woman at the United Nations who said, oh yes, the Latin Americans just think they're the cat's pajamas when it comes to violence against women. They're all doing all this policy innovation, and this is sort of what she was talking about. There's all these new policies introduced in Latin America, and in Britain, in Italy, for example, stands out. A lot of countries that you might think would be similar in other ways, in terms of culture or heritage, for example, are way behind. By 2005, we see more convergence. Oh, one thing to point out about this is that, again, look at the communists here. The post-communist countries in that kind of mustard color have crawled into the 0 to 5, in the 3 to 5 range in this particular graph by 2005, standing in stark contrast to the rest of Europe, which has started to catch up with North America, and the rest of the globe, which is far ahead. The communist countries are lagging behind on this. Forward on family law, behind on violence against women. So if I do this, so this is just an example. I could show you some more maps like that for some other issues, but I won't for now. So if we do this and we use these indices in a statistical analysis, we can use one of the things we can do to show this point that I've been making about different dynamics across issues, and also to see if we're right about which things do matter, is to do two different things. One is to apply the same model to each issue, right? The same regression model to each issue, and then show that it actually works differently on each issue. So that, in some ways, that's quite straightforward. So I'll show you that in a minute. The other thing that we do, though, once you know that the same model doesn't work for each issue, then you have to develop different models for each issue. So I'll show you a little bit of that as well. Trying to get at the distinctive dynamics of each issue. For people who are interested in these kind of details, I can say more in the discussion if there's time, but it's a panel data analysis that uses random effects because fixed effects are inappropriate for this particular data set. And sometimes you'll see that the number of observations is different for different models, and that's partly because there are different data sets, and different data sets have different gaps in them. The independent variables that we included in the analysis include a wide range of variables that cover things like social movements and policy machinery, whether CEDAW was ratified, whether there's a constitutionally established religion. I'll say more about the specifics. Other things about majority religion, colony, whether it was a colony and communist heritage, as well as standard controls like GDP and the proportion of women in government and so on. So for the areas of women's rights, and I won't talk about all of these today, but we have modeled a whole bunch of them, including violence against women, family law, the two I just told you, also abortion laws, reproductive rights funding, and then a variety of areas of economic and social rights. And I can put up at the end a slide of different publications in case you're interested in any of this issue-specific analyses. So for all of these areas, we made the, for the comparative analysis, we made the dependent variable the same, 0 out of 10. Running 0 to 10, with 10 being most equal and 0 being least equal. And again, here, low numbers are less equality, higher numbers are more equality. So this table, which I don't expect you to read, don't worry about it, I just want to make a couple points there. This is the one where I was telling you I'm applying the same model to all these different issues. So the thing to notice about this, there are a couple of things you might notice. One is that the same model has a widely varying degree of success in terms of how much it reduces the errors in each model. So in some ways you can think about these as telling you how useful is it to know all these things instead of just guessing what the average is. Right? That's one way of thinking of statistical analysis. How much information does it really give me to know these things? If I know that this country is, say, a Muslim country, if I know that this country is one with a constitutionally established religion, does that tell me anything, or am I any better off than just guessing the average, right? Because that's, from a statistical standpoint, a good guess is always just the average, more or less, right? So this is what it's telling you whether it's good. So we'll reduce, how much can I reduce the errors by using these different models? So they vary quite a bit, being pretty good for some issues and not so good for some of these other issues. So that's one thing to tell you about. And I'll show you, go back to the table in a minute to show you that the findings show that our feminist movements are important for each of these policy issues, except for maternity leave, but in very different ways. And it's especially important, these movements are especially important where women's movements are necessary to articulate women's distinctive concerns. That's when we really see the importance of these movements. Okay, so this is the same table I just showed you, but now I'm trying to highlight some things. So if you look at the coefficient for the strong autonomous women's movement in this thing, you see that it's mostly positive except for maternity leave, and it's significant, and the little stars mean it's significant, and that's in 3 of the different columns. And if we, even in this one place where it's not a kind of significant model, if we lag that for reasons that I could explain to you, there it is very much more strongly associated with the outcome. Well, that's the same as true for family law, although I haven't shown that here. Another thing to notice is that, as we mentioned before, this was an example of a status law. This is a place where movements and international norms work together, so I just showed you about movements, and you can see the same thing is true for CEDAW, which is that in the first issue, at least, in the status issue here, and violence against women is the only purely status issue here, abortion legality as well. Well, it's not a purely status issue because it's also doctrinal. So violence against women is the only issue here that is both a status issue and it's not a doctrinal or a class issue, as we described in Untitled Ecology. And you can see that that's the one where CEDA ends up being very important. And that means that it's associated, withdrawing a reservation to CEDA is associated with improved, on average, an improvement of about 2 areas on our violence against women index. Okay. So this is a bit more showing you, and I didn't do this in that other model that I showed you, but this table shows you what looks like if you interact the women's movement and the CEDA variable together. And what we really find is that where women's movements can appeal to these international norms, you have a tremendous, much more strong effect than when you have one or the other. So that the interaction of a strong autonomous feminist movement and CEDA ratification is very strong, especially over time, especially on these status areas. For religion, as I mentioned before, the coefficients on this variable, and this is actually one of these things where no matter how we measure religion, you see the negative coefficient for most cases. You can see that it's negative across most of these areas for these different types of variables. Whether it's a constitutionally established religion, or religiosity, or a religious party, it's all negative. But what's the best way of getting at what's going on with religion? And what I want to point out to you now, this is for family law, and being predominantly Catholic or Muslim matters only for different issues. So being predominantly Catholic really matters a lot for abortion, but not so much for family law. And being a predominantly Muslim nation matters more for family law, not so much for abortion. So again, it matters what kind of an issue it is. But let me show you a little bit about how useful it is to know about religion for knowing about, for example, family law. So this shows you how useful is it to know, remember I telling you about guessing the average, right? How useful is it to know whether a country is a Muslim or a non-Muslim country? So here's one, so you might say, and if you do statistical analysis, you'll get a significant coefficient, and what is that telling you? It's telling you that if it's a non-Muslim, if it's not a Muslim, predominantly Muslim nation, we know that sex equality doesn't go below a particular level, in this case 5. So these lower levels here are all in predominantly Muslim nations. So that gives us some information. It gives us some information, it tells us something. But here's the thing to notice. If we know that it is a Muslim nation, it doesn't tell us very much at all, right? So knowing it's not Muslim tells us something. But knowing that it is a predominantly Muslim nation actually doesn't tell us where on the scale it's likely to fall at all. It could be anywhere on the scale. So knowing it's a Muslim nation doesn't tell us that much in this particular way. The same is true for religiosity, right? Again, we have some information. We learn about this big white space right here. This is telling us that lower levels of religiosity are associated with higher degrees of equality in family law. Not too earth-shattering, right? So less religion, more equality in family law, you might expect that. But here's the thing to notice. At high levels of religion, it doesn't tell us very much at all. Again, it could be a low level of equality or a high level of equality. We're not really learning that much about this part of the range. So it tells us something in this part of the range, but not in this part of the range. But here's something. If we look at an institutional version, an institutional understanding of what's happening here, we get a much better, much more information, right? We get information across the whole range. So we know that where religious institutions are less fused, this is a measure of religious laws. How many laws espouse religious principles? How many secular state authority laws take up religious principles? Where that's less, where we have low levels of state support for religious law, we have high levels of equality, and where we have church and state fusion, constitutionally established religion, or in this case, a high number of laws that espouse religious things, we have low levels of equality. So we don't have a whole range here, right? We have this specific focus where it's a declining effect as we go out towards more religious, and more church-state fusion, more integration of religion and state. We're calling it political institution of religious authority. Then you have lower degrees of equality in family law. And so what does that tell us? The only thing I want to mention about that is that it's actually an institutional version of this relationship that's key. It's not the religion itself. So if you control for whether it's Muslim or Catholic, that doesn't matter as much as whether it is a fusion of church and state, fusion of mosque and state, a fusion of religious and secular authority. It's an institutional variable rather than this specific origin. Okay. And then about left parties, as I mentioned, I'm going to keep this very brief. You can see that here, we don't have left parties as being significant determinants for any of these areas, but the coefficients are in the direction that we would hypothesize, so that left parties are negative on some issues, but they're positive on the issues that we thought were class issues. And when we get into looking at more we see. And when we get into doing other kinds of modeling, looking more specifically at these specific issues, we actually do find that left parties become significant. I can show you one example of that below. And specifically, if you try to show, for example, the difference between looking at abortion legality, which is, these are both doctrinal issues, but one is also a class issue. Even in this particular issue, and I want to say that this is related, this is based on research I've done with Jose Caire, you can see that in this particular analysis, as it turns out, these are all negative. These are odds ratios, so it's a little bit harder to see. But the key thing I want you to notice is that left parties are significant for reproductive rights freedom. This is like funding for abortion and contraception, but not for abortion legality. So we don't see that left parties matter when it's just a status issue, but when it comes to putting money into the matter, when it comes to actually addressing the market, talking about economic issues, that's when left parties become important. And everything else is more or less the same between these two issues, with religion being important for both issues, movements being important more so for reproductive rights freedom, but overall with left parties mattering for reproductive rights freedom. So again, as I was saying at the beginning, if we disaggregate issues into these multiple dimensions, we get more leverage on understanding why this is. And it's not to do with saying it's this model of a woman-friendly welfare state or that model. Different types of institutional structures and different types of actors matter for these different issues. And as I hope you've seen, we're trying to tell you which actors and which institutions matter for which kinds of issues. So for status issues, it's feminist movements that are most important, and these international global norms, sometimes regional norms. For religion and institutional contexts matter most for doctrinal issues, and left parties are most important for class issues. And so why does this matter? So for thinking about this more generally, in some ways, this is one way of kind of getting at what a lot of people have been talking about in terms of taking an intersectional approach to gender equality, right? It's talking about how we see gender not as being a unidimensional phenomenon, but rather a multidimensional phenomenon. But it's, in some ways, building a new approach. There are some people who have done things that are a little bit similar. I think of Dara Strolovich's work on different policy issues as being kind of similar, where she classifies issues according to which groups they benefit. This is a little bit like that, but we're building here kind of an approach that I think, I hope anyway, provides a way of actually furthering some of that research a little bit. Okay. And also, we've also shown, I think, that class, group status, and religion can define different dimensions of gender. More generally, it might suggest that you can do something like this for even political science and political issues more generally. Anytime you're talking about status hierarchy issues, you might be able to say, look, these political actors might be important and these other actors might not be important. We might want to be disaggregating issues less by topic, like in public policy and comparative public policy, we tend to say, like, okay, here's comparative health and here's comparative transportation or whatever. And what we might want to do instead is ask disaggregate these baskets of issues into looking at the different aspects of them. Which ones challenge class, which ones challenge the market, which ones have religious distinctions, what social identities are involved. And here I'm thinking about Christian Davenport's great research, if you know it at all, where he talks about the kind of received wisdom about state-society relations when it comes to protest. Who gets repressed when they're protesters? Well, the received wisdom in the work on protest is that people who raise issues of property or who destroy property get repressed by the state. So what Christian Davenport says is that works for white protesters, but black protesters get repressed no matter what issue they raise, right? So for some people, issues matter, but identities also matter in terms of looking at the relationship between the state and civil society. And so this is no different. And it suggests that this is another way of thinking about the ways that identities and institutions intersect to structure policy. And we might not want to think about the usual divisions of comparative politics structuring all issues in the same way, and to be a bit more open about thinking about what are the factors or explanatory approaches that might be most useful, and that they might vary for different kinds of women's rights, for different areas of human rights, for different areas of public policy, in ways that we don't now necessarily recognize. So I'll stop there, and I'll say these are the articles, some of the articles that have been published. And actually, this one, Politics and Gender, came out in September this year, forthcoming, because they didn't actually tell us they published it, but I just discovered a couple days ago. Somebody wrote to me and said, oh, I like your article. And I said, oh, was it out? It's actually out in September. So all of these articles present a bit more detail some of the analyses I've just sort of referred to as we've been going along. So stop there and hopefully